All right, and we are live for another episode of the HEADPHONE Show, and today we have the wonderful reviewer Crin and Matt Economist from Cascadia Audio, CEO of Cascadia Audio, and
I mean,
and then we have the wonderful Tyler helping out as well, looking majestic as ever, with the nice orange glow of the post-apocalyptic future we now live in.
Yep,
At least on the West Coast.
very excellent.
Yeah. Welcome to everybody in the chat. And yeah, we might as well just get started. And yeah, how are you guys doing? Like, how's it been for the last couple of weeks? I know, Corinne, I mean, the big news for you is obviously that you got the new measurement rig. So I guess, yeah, my first question for you is, what have you discovered so far with it? And like what kinds of differences are you seeing between the Gross system and your old system? For those who aren't aware, Crin just recently got a Gross 43AG setup, which is the same setup that we're using and many others are using as well. So yeah, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, the old system. In terms of IEM measurements,
I meant for over ears, but yeah, go ahead.
Oh, over ears. Okay, that's a bit of a. I would say it's a bit of a more complicated situation because on paper, the 711 coupler that I have is not that much different from the RA0402 that I have on the Grass, which is the ear simulator. That's on paper. But the moment you add in the pinna simulator as well as measuring a headphone on this whole rig, the differences sort of multiply. I'm not sure why this is. I'm sure Matt Economist can give more insight into why the occluded ear simulator sort of matters even more when it comes to a headphone measurement. It's an interesting observation that I see that I probably wouldn't have if I didn't like do all of these weird simulation things and if I were to stick to, let's say, a flat plate or ears, the mini DSP ears.
Right. But you were using the, I'm just let me know if this is correct, but before you were using the existing 711, which coupler or ear sim, which would be the 0045, right? And then that was what you were using with, like, in conjunction with the Gross pinna, right?
It's not an official 0045.
Right.
I believe it's it is a clone, and this is kind of like an open secret at this point. And it's based off of the Brew & Care type 495.
Right.
And it comes relatively close to that. Obviously, the 4195 also has slight differences in terms of manufacturing to a 0045. And that's primarily what makes up the difference. I mean, in overall senses, like a Brew & Care head and torso simulator would still be in the standard of IEC 60318-7. I believe it's 7. Yeah,
it's 7.
And yeah, in terms of how all of the manufacturers come together and manage to hit the target, that's how they do it. But if you're talking about absolute differences, yeah, there is definitely a difference when it comes to my coupler versus the Grass coupler. Not enough for me to want to completely restart my database, and I shudder at the thought because it Jesus Christ, it's 780 measurements. I'm never doing that again.
That's for IEMs especially. I wanted to ask though, I mean, before you even got the Gross system, you were using the mini DSP ears pinna, right? Like the ear flange piece there, right? And you'd sort of coupled that to the 711, the
metal Tonal extension.
And so, like, now that you have, like, the official, with the RA402 and the KB 5001 or whatever, what sort of differences are you noticing between the new system and, like, the Franken rig from before?
It's more similar than different.
Yeah, that's what I'm surprised by, and it's interesting.
I mean, the concept of both rigs are more or less there, where you simulate the occluded ear, and then you simulate the pinna.
Mm-hmm.
The canal is kind of the crapshoot here because I'm using the default metal canal extension of the union nut and all that.
Which is too
So
long for the actual standard for the year, unfortunately.
yeah. So the interesting thing about the KB 5000 or 5001 is that apparently it dips in the region of like 8,000 hertz and 10,000 hertz. This is more apparent on headphones like the HD 800 and even the HD 650 actually.
Are you
So
talking about
actually
the
all of the headphones, it's
pinna
it's a
notch?
very consistent difference. In like even like when I'm talking about in comparison to the ears plus 711 rig.
Mm-hmm. So for
You're
anybody,
talking about a high Q notch around 8 to 10, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah. That's the pinna notch.
for anybody who's wondering,
Mhm.
KB 5000 and 5001 are these here. I'm showing them on the on the screen.
Wow, they get to see you and we don't.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. So they're essentially the earpiece that goes onto the plate. So, but what you're talking about there is the notch there what Oratory refers to as the concha interaction in his FAQ.
Yeah, should be.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
I don't see why it's not because well, yeah, like I said, using a different pinna and using a different canal results in a different result. So it's absolutely because of the KB 5000.
Maybe this is a question for Matt Economist, but do you think there are other features like that, or is this just a matter of coarse grain versus fine grain?
When you say other features like that, what do you mean?
Like other features of the KB 5000 and 5001 that are supposed to show up there. I'm just trying to think of like situations where like if something doesn't match the target and you don't know, necessarily about the feature, like for example the 8 to 10k hertz notch that's supposed to be there. Is there anything else that's like that on the KB 5001 that you're aware of?
Well, so like the pinna notch is just sort of part of our spatial hearing, depending on the actual geometry of like the bowl of the bottom of the concha and the how am I forgetting what it's called? The little flappy thing towards the front.
You get different ones.
Yeah, I think so. And you can see it on different heads if you measure, just inside the canal. The main things that you would probably with the KB 5000/5001, at least when I have looked at comparison plots of them versus other, the older Gross pinna, is that the compressibility of the ears difference is quite significant with any headphone which doesn't have quite deep pads.
Interesting.
Yeah, a friend of mine actually made an album of comparisons. Brent Butterworth had both the KB 5001 and the older Shure 0055 Gross pin. I don't remember what that one was. The RA0067, I think. Maybe RO61. But the impact was quite substantial and quite variable on a per headphone basis. You'd see things like, and this is something that I've noted myself when I've compared stiffer to less stiff ears. Hi-fi mans actually have different upper mids depending on how much the concha can deflect.
So this reminds me a little bit of what Tom from Dunu was talking about too. He was talking about with in-ears and like it's difficult to simulate tissue because the hardness of the material may have an impact for the compared to what it's actually like on a real human. But this made me think of as well just the differences that we come across. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of echo. Has anybody gotten a is anybody not wearing headphones?
I'm wearing headphones. Is it me? I'm wearing my HD 800s. That's probably
okay. Oh, it's probably
okay.
Let
me just swap it.
But yeah, I want to ask about probably once he puts the other headphones on, he probably can't hear me right now. But times when there's differences between what we hear and what we measure. So when there's not agreement between the measurement and the subjective experience, which like from, I don't know, maybe Crin as well, like have you encountered this at all when for over-ear headphones, like where you come up with a measurement and you're like, oh, I don't actually hear it like that. That's okay.
There are many examples.
Hmm.
I can't think of one off the top of my head. Oh, there is one recent one. I haven't published a graph, so I haven't published any graphs yet. But do you know of the Spirit Torino Radiante?
I've heard the name Spirit Torino before, but I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah. It's basic. The short form is just Spirit Torino.
Isobaric,
It measures
right?
it measures horribly. Like it's bad. And today I was in a data gathering spree. So I wasn't listening to any of the headphones. I was just kind of like being a robot, just putting it onto the rig, measuring next one. But I saw the graph first, and I thought like, oh man, this is gonna sound like absolute complete garbage. So it was one of the few headphones that I just decided to put it on and listen to it, and it was bad. Don't get me wrong, it was definitely still bad, but it was not as bad as the graph would have led me to suggest otherwise.
Right.
It was still bad, but not as bad as that. Yeah. So it's not necessarily misleading, but I'm sure when people eventually see the graph of the Spirit Torino, they would assume that it is like one of the worst sounding headphones, and I would say I have heard worse. But that's also the highest praise that I could give that headphone.
Yeah, I had a similar experience with the PM50. It wasn't the worst I'd ever heard, but it was definitely one of them.
I mean, PM50, is that Oppo?
No. That's Andover.
Andover.
Yeah.
I never heard of it. One day.
But vis-a-vis the Torino, I don't suppose that you have the graph. I mean, I guess showing it on the stream might be kind of cumbersome.
I need to process it and shit because it's all in an AMDAT file.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunate. Because I was curious about what features would make you expect to hear really bad stuff. Because
just okay, I can like process it on the fly right now, so we can just like, keep talking.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to see if I can find one, but I can't. Nobody's done it yet, other than Crinacle.
Yeah, no, he's the first.
It looks bad, but doesn't sound. Okay, it still sounds bad. It doesn't sound as bad as the graph would lead you to suggest.
If you send it to me on Twitter, then I can.
Oh yeah, I could just post it in Discord right now. Yeah, but feel free to move on to the next
problem
topic while I struggle.
Yeah, the problem with sending it on Discord is that like that's all full screened, so I can't actually. That's what's being captured. But so Twitter's better.
Just tweet it at Resolve.
Yeah. You might as well put it out there in the wild. So yeah, no, what we were getting at before is maybe the reasons for why headphone measurements may not agree with subjective experience. And actually, I was going to say, for the most part, like from what I've been measuring and whatnot, my experience is that for the most part they're correlated pretty well. Like it tracks the experience. But then yeah, there are times when it doesn't, and then I've talked to Matt about this as well. But to me, it's like, okay, how do we figure this out? And is it a matter of the differences in physical ear shape and all this? Because one of the weird things about that to me is that in theory there should be a lot more agreement between different pinnas and different ear gain factors, or there should be more agreement among them because of the normalization that happens. I'm just wondering, is it because that in some cases the normalization can't account for some of the dramatic changes that might show up there for different gain factors?
When you say the normalization, what are you?
Sorry, like the brain's. I'm probably just talking about HRTF.
So, if you think about it, I don't want to jump on Crin here. If you have a comment, you can go first.
Just go on.
everyone has their own HRTF, but well, actually a whole bunch of them. And our brains expect some permutation of our head's HRTF based on where we perceive sound to come from. That's the whole argument for DF for headphones that kind of still sort of syncs up with Harman, sort of. A headphone, however, could theoretically have a static transfer function that didn't vary on an individual basis. Like if you have a speaker that's flat and you put two people in front of it and measure at their eardrum, you'll get two different lines.
Right.
Which are, their HRTFs under those circumstances. If you put a headphone on those two people, in some cases, you'll get two different lines that look the same. In some cases, you'll get two different lines that look different. And if they look different in the same ways that the HRTFs are different, you would expect them to be perceived differently in the same way.
Right. Okay. And so what does that mean for what the actual differences are for the physical ear? I mean, in theory, then in that case where they are different, the physical ear different, or the impacts on the frequencies by the physical ear would be more significant then, you'd have to imagine, right? Or does that not matter? Like, I guess the question is like how significant is it at all related to how significant the amplification ends up being based on the ear?
Well, I mean, yes, circumstantially. I mean, I guess it depends on basically the delta in our perception, as said, comes down to the difference between what our brain expects and what it receives. A headphone that was able to perfectly approximate how our ear interacted with whatever our reference sound field is would sound, in theory, the same to anyone.
Right.
But most don't. How much of an issue this is not entirely obvious in the lit. In theory, if it was a really big problem, you'd expect that in-ear monitors basically wouldn't work.
Right.
Because they bypass the entirety of the pinna and part of the canal. But even discounting that, it's probable that it accounts for some of the variation in how people perceive headphones, particularly at higher frequencies. I'm not so sure. At lower frequencies, I do think people really underestimate how much coupling variation matters. Like, a 2 decibel difference in the bass is very easy to have with almost any acoustic principle, and it's really quite audible, but not always immediately obvious as, oh, the bass is rolled off. It can just be, oh, it lacks weight, or oh, it's sort of pitched up.
And this is where the question about what is dynamics comes into play, and maybe there's a explanation there or correlation there. But of course, those are just subjectivist terms.
I mean, hey, listen, this is a nonpartisan podcast, right?
Of course. I mean, well, we've talked about this, but yeah. So that is interesting. But just sort of jumping off of that subject, I had this other question about like normalization. Again, I'm using this term normalization, but like the idea of what our brain expects to hear changing over the course of listening to a headphone, and sort of like normalizing that and adapting to it in a way, like the brain adapting to the sound that it's being given. And I'm wondering, do the tolerance, like, is there a threshold for where the tolerances should be for that kind of change? Like, ideally, we wouldn't want the brain to have to normalize too much, right? Like, we'd want to be able to just make it so that it sounds great and we don't have to do too much adjustment. But one of the things I have noticed is that, like, if you listen for like an hour, that'll start to sound a little bit more normal if it's like a little bit off, right? And then with that, as a part of that long-winded question, what I wonder, I mean, this is sort of a question for both of you guys, but if this is something that can also apply to things that are perceived as, or often referred to as, technical aspects, like detail or soundstage and whatnot. So but what's your guys' take on that, on normalization?
I mean, I don't want to go first every time.
Go ahead.
No, I'm punting.
Okay.
Normalization is in like Okay, I'm just gonna throw a different question. Do you believe that the concept of normalization also extends to something like if you try something, if you're used to something, uh, you know, before trying out a new thing, the old reference is now what you perceive to be good, and therefore anything that deviates from this old reference is, uh, you know,
I,
seen as bad,
I
right?
I would say, I mean, that's one scenario, but I'm also thinking of other scenarios where you might initially not like something, but that's only because you're used to something. Like, you might initially not like something that's technically better, but you're just not used to it yet. And then also, the flip side of this is you may actually be able to appreciate something that is technically not as good, if you like, maybe not to the same degree, but you'll still maybe be able to appreciate it to a certain degree more than you might have if you just first put it on for 5 minutes and were like, oh, this isn't that good, I don't like it, and then maybe you listen to it for an hour and then you go, oh wait, no, I'm actually starting to be a little bit more okay with this, right? Like that
I mean,
effect.
that just sounds like brain burning to me.
It is, right? So that's what I'm
Yeah.
wondering, right? Like, does that is there a limit to that, and where should the tolerances be essentially for both normalization of things like frequency response, and then also, is this something that I'm just thinking, like, is it possible for people to go like detail blind?
Okay, my own personal opinion is that there's actually no limit, or virtually no limit, when it comes to these kinds of normalizations. So given enough, like literally, I like to call it, what's the term I use? Stockholm syndroming yourself into liking something.
Yes.
It's a common thing amongst a lot of reviewers, especially the ones that receive free units, where it's where the product in question is, some would consider objectively bad, let's say on FR,
Mm-hmm.
or something that is a deal breaker. Sometimes products get shipped out of phase. Certain things happen, but because
Wait,
they got
what?
it for free, they are expecting a good review. They, as I said, Stockholm syndrome themselves into liking it. They spend hundreds and hundreds of hours of listening time on it, even though that first hour, that first crucial hour, they thought it was bad.
Yeah.
It's a track that I see a lot of reviewers going into, because there is this misconception that listening time equals some weird form of gives you more credence,
Mm-hmm. More
which
authority,
which makes
yeah.
which makes sense. Like, yes, like you have analyzed the sound and everything, but we are humans, and when you spend that much time on a product, either you hear the flaws, which that is if you're experienced, or if you're not that experienced, you gloss over the flaws. You get used to the flaws,
Mm-hmm.
and at that point, that's a normalization.
Yeah.
All products will sound good the longer you hear it, because that's just how our brain works. Our brain doesn't want to hear unpleasant things. Our brains filter out all of the unpleasant things whenever you hear a product for a long period of time, especially if you're going to be forcing yourself, so-called, into listening to this thing, whether out of obligation or some would say buyer's remorse.
Or, yeah, purchase
Yeah,
justification as
yeah,
well. You want to like the
yeah.
thing that you bought, and
So
so yeah, you force yourself.
normalization exists. I don't think anyone would disagree. Some call it brain burning, some call it post-purchase rationalization, but all of them are basically the same concept.
Right. And so, like, with that, what I'm wondering, though, is, I mean, is it possible to go the other way, where your brain gets so used to? I mean, I saw Metal 571 saying this, talking about this in the chat, but like, one of the critically important things is that it's for the same reason that if you listen to a headphone early in the morning, and this is the first thing that you listen to, you may notice things about that you wouldn't have noticed or paid attention to if it was the last thing you listened to at the end of the day. You're getting
Yeah,
listener fatigue and all these other qualities, and then
that's just human nature.
Yeah.
Your very sinuses themselves would affect the way that you
Yeah,
listen to music. So I'm not saying that listening or analyzing a product for long periods of time is a bad thing. I'm just saying that there is a trap, and that trap is like sort of brain burning in yourself into liking something or glossing over said flaws. But listening and analyzing and reviewing for long periods of time would also account for these kind of mood shifts.
Mm-hmm.
Where one day you feel great, mentally you're very positive, and therefore you find more positive things to say about a certain product. And then some days you feel a bit more depressed, or just not all there, and
Right.
and then you're a lot more pedantic in those on those days, and you find more flaws, which could be good, but also could be bad, because you might be not giving the same different products the same fair shot.
You woke up on the
You're
wrong
looking
side of
for
the bed.
flaws. Yeah, you're looking for
Yeah.
the things.
So it's I mean, I more or less built my career around like first impressions. So I want to say that long periods of listening is not that important. But these things, the whole concept of human mood and how it changes so willy-nilly, is definitely evidence to point towards, like, yes, you should review this for longer than just 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I worry about, not actively, I'm not like, up late at night worrying about this, but it's something that I'm concerned about is if I listen to, Hi-Fi Man's Svara or Final Audio D8000 Pro, or like one of these like, hyper detailed headphones, is the fact that it's detailed to me only detailed to me, or the fact that it sounds that way to me only like that for the short duration that I'm evaluating it, is this something that I would eventually not perceive as, or being as detailed or as clear, because of this brain burn-in effect, and normalization, whatever we want to call it. And to this, I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's essential for reviewers to compare things and be like, okay, I got this on, how does this compare to the other thing, right? That kind of counteracts that a little bit. But if somebody's just to buy a really high-end, like highly, let's say, again, perceptively detailed headphone, is it possible for that perception to kind of wane a little bit, just because of the brain burn-in effect? Yeah, again, for either of you guys.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is absolutely a possibility, but for the same reason why it would wane, it would also come back.
Yeah.
It goes both ways.
So this means that everybody needs to own bad headphones.
I mean,
yeah,
kind of.
Yes. I mean, okay, like I'm an IEM guy,
right?
So
you only
my
own bad
version
headphones.
of so-called bad IEMs
Wow.
would be just something that comes off of the phone. But that's the thing, is that sometimes things that come with a phone are pretty decent. For example, the AKG Samsung 955, I think. I forget the whole name of the models. But yeah, I do have bad IEMs, but at the same time, like, I don't think it's a necessity to own one. But then again, even something like the AirPods would be a decent,
right?
What's the word I'm
like a
looking
reset,
for? Anti-reference.
Yeah.
Reference, incidentally, is sort of the word that's been haunting, but not that present in this whole thing. The concept of something that we're very normalized to really is our reference sound. And the question of what should be the reference is something that I think that a lot of people
Speakers.
That's the other thing I was going to bring up as well. Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, what speakers under what circumstances, and for that matter, what the fuck did the speaker, if you're a speaker reviewer, what's your reference?
Most studio reference monitors tend to sound similar-ish. Like you could wax poetic all day about the minute differences, but in terms of like what they set out to do, to be something of a flat neutral sound. Most studio reference monitors do that job fairly well. Am I wrong in saying
Well,
that?
won't you have to also take the room into consideration and all the rest of
Yeah, I
this?
was gonna say you're
No,
gonna
no,
have a
I mean like
meaningful
more
contribution from
towards
the
like
room's
near
sound.
fields and something that is less dependent on room acoustics. I mean, obviously near fields still depend on room acoustics, which is why you do the whole like you're supposed to arrange it in a on the breadth wise of the room or something like that. I forget. There's like very specific ways you want to maximize the potential of your near fields, but it's not as significant as if you were to use like a two channels floor standing speaker and all that, right?
Well, but near field listening is just a different sound field for your head to be in. Like you're getting more direct sound and less indirect. But is that more accurate?
No, I'm saying that it's a decent reference.
But reference for what?
Well,
Just like how flat is supposed to sound, I guess.
well, but
Because
there's a
that's
difference. There's a question between flat and just the difference between listening to headphones and speakers. That also
Yeah,
needs to be
I
accounted
mean,
for.
I mean, in terms of like the reference headphone, that's even harder to determine. Like some would say HD 600, 650, some would say the Focal Utopia, others would say like I don't know. But most people tend to congregate around like
Oh.
the HD 600, 650 cam.
Oh, bravo! Clearly reference.
Yes, clearly, absolutely.
But I mean, yeah. So like with all that stuff, I mean, like that on its own for people like us is, I mean, we have all like multiple different headphones that, we're constantly evaluating, constantly switching back and forth. But I'm wondering for the people who buy a pair of headphones, I'm trying to think about like as far as like giving recommendations. Should our tolerance or should we err on the side of wide tolerances for frequency response and narrow tolerances for technical performance? Like in Crin's ranking list, should we say, okay, I know you have your you can only go up by a certain amount based on technical performance, but should we say, okay, well, frequency or tonal balance, maybe it's like a B, but for technical performance it's like an S, and therefore the brain burn-in will make it so that the B tonal balance is not as bad, and it's worth getting that over something that's the reverse of that, where it's maybe an S class tonal balance but only a B level technical performance.
I guess I'll start by explaining my rationale for the way that I arranged that whole dichotomy of tonality versus technicalities. Yes, like I could err on the side of technicalities, but the way that I see it is that why would I lower the bar, lower the standards for what a high performing headphone should be? Like for example, if you have one headphone that has again, let's use the example of my ranking list: S tier S tier technicalities but B tier tonality, and then you have another headphone that has S tier technicalities and S tier tonality. Would you put these two headphones on the same league, so to speak? And I would say, why would you? One is so-called superior, and the other one is it so-called requires EQ or has a certain glaring weakness on the frequency response. Now, clearly, you could EQ it out, which is why there is this divide. Like
Right.
I split it up so that people who want to arrange by technicalities can just like just click a button and there you go. If you want to assume that you have the perfect EQ for every single headphone, there you go. But not everyone has that. And
Right.
then with the problem with EQ is that what would you EQ it to? And that's a whole other can of worms that people say like, oh, you should EQ it to Harman. Well, which Harman? You should EQ it to flat. Well, which flat? Diffuse field, free field, what kind of diffuse field, and etc. etc. So even with the whole like just EQ all of your headphones, you don't have to care about tonality. You just need to care about technicalities. Well, then you still need to care about tonality, because tonality is the first thing that everyone hears.
Yep.
Like
Definitely.
it's not technicalities. It's not about the dynamics. It's not whatever. The first thing you hear is, is it V-shaped? Is it flat? Is it whatever? Is the bass recessed? Is the treble too sharp? All of these are just this frequency response. And it is the one thing that makes you either listen to that headphone more or drop it on the spot.
Right. Especially in cases where it's significant, deviations from what you prefer.
Yeah.
Implicit in this is that, technical and tonal performance aren't correlated.
I was gonna say that's.
I'm not really sure is something I would agree with.
I mean, but if you're talking about the whole objectivist argument, yes, but I like to be a filthy centrist. I like to marry both camps together, and I would say like frequency response on one hand, and the other hand, I just put on the headphones and listen.
Yeah.
And then if I hear it and it sounds quote unquote blunted, then the technical score just goes down the drain. And on the other hand, if it sounds sharp, as in terms of the leading eight transients, if it sounds sharp, there's no like issue in terms of whether or not it sounds blunted or not. But then there's some wonkiness going on with the frequency response. Well, then the score goes the other way.
Right.
Okay, so here's the thing that I'm sort of picking at here, and I don't mind separating out multiple categories that might be correlated with each other, but you're talking earlier on. You were saying if everyone EQ'd everything, you would only care about technical. That's only true if the technical performance is completely independent of the frequency response. Otherwise, when you EQ things, you'd be potentially messing up things there. My question is, have you EQ'd these things together and still had that same perception of, like, does the technical score come from the raw FR or from them EQ'd to some constant curve?
I did experiment on that, and you do bring up a good point. Fixing some tonal issues does actually improve the. I don't want to know if it's absolute or if it's the perception of quote unquote technical ability. So the whole point of me separating tonality and technicalities, because technicalities is in this like weird gray area of we don't know what it is. Nobody has a general consensus of what it actually all are. So yeah, I mean, you could call it snake oil bullshit and everything. It's just how I hear things, and I have EQ'd it. But in certain cases, when I EQ'd like some headphones to the Harman target, IEMs in this instance, there is still some weirdness going on. For example, like what's this thing? I've EQ'd the AKG N400 as well as the Galaxy Buds Plus, both of which have already been tuned to the Harman target, but I added an extra layer of EQ just to keep them like within 0.5 decibels of each other. And even then, I heard this weird like timbral issue in the treble, specific only to the Buds Plus. Now, it's not a blind test. I know that is something else that I have to arrange. But I've done small scale testing of what exactly is tonal and what exactly is technical. And in certain regards, like the intangible things like timbre does not seem to be fully correlated to FR in my case.
In that kind of timbre, at least.
Yeah.
Because I mean, so with all of this, I mean, the EQ subject in particular, wouldn't that also depend? I mean, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but like, wouldn't that also depend on how fine-grained you're able to get the EQ? Because one of the things I always see, even when I'm doing my own EQ, is if I'm just adjusting wide ranges, I'm getting it so that the curve close or not. It loosely matches, what some other headphone is. Like I'll use a different headphone as a reference curve. Like I've been actually playing around with like the HD650 as a reference curve, for example. Tuning something or EQing something so that it kind of matches that, you can get reasonably close, but that's not necessarily as fine-grained. Like, imagine no smoothing, nothing whatsoever, and you had like perfect environment, for everything. I don't know if our EQs are able to ever match perfectly, or maybe I'm wrong about this, but if that's the case, then that would mean that those technical aspects are much more strongly correlated with the frequency response. Or it's more that EQing things to be matched to the same coarse grained curve or target curve isn't necessarily a good indicator or predictor of it not having the same technical performance.
Yeah, there's also, of course, in situ variation to bear in mind. Like, a headphone may measure a certain way on a fixture at one position, but the actual pressure at your eardrum may differ somewhat for a number of reasons. So there's a lot of... If there has been an experiment where two headphones have been matched in terms of actual response at the eardrum so that we could isolate for some of these things, I don't know of it, and such a thing would be very hard to do.
Right.
So, I mean, you could say that's, and indeed I consider that part of, headphone design. You're figuring out what's the trade-offs and how this is going to interact with humans.
Right.
As best you can.
The other thing I just wanted to mention about this subject was that, I mean, Crin being a centrist, I empathize because all again, Mad Economist, I've talked about this before, but like all I ever feel confident in reporting when I'm reviewing something is my it's what the experience is like. It's the subjective experience of something, and we can give the data and draw information from the data, but my issue is that I don't know enough about the correlation between the data and the experience to be able to draw a straight line. And so for me, like, yeah, I'm in sort of in the same boat. I tend to think that, okay, while I don't have a data point reference for what it is that I'm experiencing, what it is like, this sort of phenomenological account, at the same time, that doesn't mean that I want to discount what the data is showing and say that it's not necessarily captured by it. I just don't know enough yet. Moving on, I feel like we've gone through that one.
Because they kind of went down that fun path. Actually, I've been chatting with a bunch of people regarding similar thoughts, and a couple of them are audio engineers, and then also I was in a chat with some of the other guys on a different thing. We're talking about speakers mostly, and I remember reading an article about it. We had a big long discussion. I've been kind of trying to get the article from them where it's at, but essentially what it came down to is a bunch of audio engineer guys were saying they don't understand why everyone keeps going after the studio neutral or studio sound when they engineer the music to be for enjoyment home listening. And so what's your take on that, you guys? Because like that seems to be one of the more that no one else really talks about, like the audio engineering side of the space. Like everyone keeps talking about the technicalities of the headphones or the speakers, that kind of stuff. But when you actually look at the audio engineer side of it, or like what they're trying to present, doesn't necessarily, like, how does that jive with what you guys are doing with the measurement piece of it? Because that could be something that could be a factor in to why things aren't necessarily matching up, maybe. Or I'm not a scientist, I'm just throwing questions.
I mean, no one here is, to be fair. Some of us just roleplay them on the internet. An actual scientist who has weighed in on that, though, Sean Olive, calls what you're referring to. No, but he's weighed in on this specific thing you're talking about. He calls it the circle of confusion.
Yeah.
The basic concept is, as you say, a recording engineer is making a recording to sound a certain way on a hypothetical playback system. And that's based on the references of what they're hearing and what they're expecting to play back on. And the people making the playback system are making it to sound a certain way with a certain recording. And thus there's a feedback loop where it's not actually necessarily stable because no one actually has a solid reference. The people who are making the recordings have what they think they're going to be played back on, and the people making the reproduction equipment have what they think they're going to be, the recordings that are going to be used for it. but it's all basically just our best guess of what the other side is going to do. That's one of the reasons that Sean is very staunch in his advocacy of standardizing at roughly where we are. So that's why he likes speakers in a room as a target. That's why he likes speakers that match what all people already prefer in speakers, because he figures if studio engineers make stuff for good speakers presently, then using good speakers as the reference ensures that all of the existing body of recording will continue to sound good with whatever our new good standard is. At least I think I've not butchered his take too much.
And mind you, like, I'm not like a measurements guy or like a, but I like to think that I would have a general like common sense of thinking about things. And so to me, which that makes sense, and I think the averages and everything. But what about like, so Crin can kind of talk on this too a little bit more. But it seems like when you use just speakers as the main reference, I mean, these are not speakers, right? And then IEMs especially, that's like beamed directly into your ear. Like, how does that square when you're looking at measurements to those type of things and those curves? And like, I'm just trying to, like, I'm playing also devil's advocate a little bit and trying to figure out like how does that play into that experience or into measurements or into those things, like, because I get the curve, and I also think that with all averages, there's always those outliers, and so there's always going to be people that don't necessarily fall in line with that general average.
But hold on, you mean like the fact that it's not necessarily for the target curve, but the fact that it's a difference in terms of device.
That was a multi-part question. So like the fact that you have the averages based on a speaker room, with a person sitting in it in the perfect spot, I'm assuming, right? So they've completely set it up to where the speakers are perfectly aimed at the person. They got the HRTF perfectly aligned. My camera is doing autofocus like crazy. But you can't do that with headphones. You can put them on a coupler, and you can put them on things. The same with the IEMs, right? But you're like those kind of subtract out certain parts of that HRTF, right? I think just because there's no other way around.
They'd subtract the there's the actual like torso, neck angle, all that stuff, right? And this actually, it kind of goes back to what Corinne was talking about in the last one we did, where he's saying for IEMs, like, manufacturers kind of have to assume what is sort of normal here for people. But I'll let Mad jump in on that.
Wait, what? No, you had a thing going.
No, just like to me, what Tyler was saying here. I mean, the interesting thing with that's always been something on my mind is like the difference, not in terms of what the overall tuning ends up being for speakers and headphones. Like, if we want to get, again, Sean Olive's use of flat measuring speakers in a decent room, if
I don't know, it's not exactly flat measuring as
right.
such.
It's not,
I went down the rabbit hole on that not long ago, but yeah, like, assuming we're using some sort of good speaker setup as a reference point, there's still a difference in terms of proximity to the eardrum, and also the crossfeed, and like that you get naturally just from being at a distance from something. And so apart from the frequency response, even if we're able to say measure at the eardrum what a good measuring speaker would, or a speaker in a good room would be, and then get something very similar to that with headphones, I'd suspect that the experience would still be a little different, but maybe not. Like, what's your take on that?
Okay, so there's sort of two parts here. I perceive Tyler is talking about the acoustic side of a headphone is a closely coupled device to the eardrum, particularly an in-ear monitor. A speaker is somewhat coupled to your room, but a lot of sound propagating in space. That just has a different transfer function at the eardrum. If it's actually having its coil moving similarly or what have you, take or any other reference point, the eardrum power is different. If you get the eardrum power the same, there is still the problem that you're pointing at, which is that what we hear is in relation to what we hear, which is a very useless way of saying it, but there's a weird feedback loop, as best as I understand it, at least, in how our brain's perception of localization and of subjective timbre are cross-correlated. On the one hand, we use HRTF cues to place sounds in space. But on the other hand, our placement of sounds in space affects the HRTF that our brain subtracts from sound so that we get the same subjective timbre. Because otherwise, something to your right would sound different than something that was behind you by a massive amount. Like we're talking, like the difference between the ipsilateral transfer function of your ear and the one for behind or in front of you, tens of dBs at some frequencies, and they're pretty significant ones. But it's not like you suddenly hear a guitar is super shrill when you turn your head.
I'm just curious why you use the term timbre there.
Because I'm a fanboy for Gunther Thiel. And that's the term. He always uses timbre and tone color to describe this.
Okay, interesting. I would not have thought that would be... Because, yeah, I would not have thought of that as, like, complex tones and things like that.
Yeah, that's... He likes tone color, but if I said tone color, I'd sound like a weird nerd.
No, but if you look at what timbre is, that's essentially what, or people talk about it as tone character. Like, you can. It sounds even worse.
Yeah.
But
so that's, and from like the data side, this is not terribly well studied. Although I will note Thiel has studied it more than most. What we do know is that the closer you get to people perceiving sounds as being actually in space, so like actually coming from a pair of speakers, if you can trick someone into thinking the sound coming from their headphones is from a pair of speakers in front of them, then replicating the sound at the eardrum alone will be perceived pretty much the same. But when you're wearing headphones, and you turn your head and the sound that was in your right ear, it's like the sound source just rotated perfectly to follow your head. That breaks some of the illusion of it being in space, separate from...
Unless you have that.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's a legitimately very good argument for that.
But it was so weird to me.
I think there's another issue that's beyond just frequency response, which is crossfeed.
Mm-hmm.
Because music is tuned and mastered for speakers.
Yeah.
If you want music that's tuned and mastered for headphones, you would have to get a binaural recording.
Mm-hmm.
So for that reason alone, getting a headphone and expecting something to sound like speakers or sound true to quote unquote what the artist intended, it's not, you're not going to be 100% there unless you have like a really, really strong and robust crossfeed system already implemented in your audio chain.
Phonitor X has one.
Yeah, they have it. But real quick, I don't really like this whole like how the artist intended it concept.
I sit it with
I know. It's like unless you're literally sitting in the studio that they're at the stage that they're playing at. That's what they intended, and then it goes through like how many different levels before it even gets to a streaming service, a CD, a record. I mean,
ideally, like hopefully as they intended, because maybe there's other limitations as well that they have to deal with.
Yeah, there's also that, like how
could only afford the budget for
the microphones
this one studio.
Like there's so many factors into that. But I mean,
but I am saying that like when the moment you choose to have a headphone, you're already having like that one extra degree of separation from what, again, quote unquote, the artist intended. Because at the end of the day, traditional modern recordings are done on two-channel systems or two-channel speakers, and that and in a way it also relies on the crossfeed that a traditional two-channel system would provide. And the moment you remove this like crossfeed, you get get an unnatural listen, and I say unnatural in that it is true. It is not ideal. Yeah.
Not the way you would hear it if you were there live either.
As close as you can get with the system that you have.
But see, but I like that. Like I know it's not the same as speakers, but I like if I am messing with CrossFit,
I'm just like answering Tyler's like sort of question about how you could get as close as possible to real life. But I'm saying like the moment you have a headphone,
speakers aren't real life.
No, speakers aren't real life. But in terms of like putting on a headphone versus getting speakers, there's already that one extra degree of separation on a headphone.
I mean, I would argue that I don't know. You get. I mean, yes, I completely agree. That's of one
unless
degree.
it's
But
binaural. Unless it's
that's
binaural.
that was one, and then well, the other is that even in non-binaural recordings, there are certain things that, as unnatural as they might be to hear, you can hear better still with headphones, right?
Oh, in general, people have better hearing acuity with headphones.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
it's coupled to your head. It's like you can
speakers
focus
have high
better.
distortion. No one's denying that.
Well, even outside of that, it's the lack of room reflections makes things. It makes perceiving small details a lot easier.
Mhm.
Almost any time
Yeah.
you test what people can hear, they will test a bit better with headphones.
Hence why hearing tests have headphones in a sound dampened room.
Is that why, or just because
Nah,
it's inconvenient to have?
I'm big,
really-
I pulled that right out of my butt. I'm not gonna lie to you.
I have a lot of thoughts on audiograms, but that's controversial. Anyway, I did want to say vis-a-vis speakers, something that's funny to me as a measurements nerd, because particularly someone who's really interested in measurements on human heads. There's two things that you see people talking about a lot for things like that, like Smith and Bach. On the one hand, you have headphones being equalized to sound like a pair of speakers in a room at your ears. But the other thing that people do with it, and it's funny that crosstalk was being invoked so much, is crosstalk cancellation for the
Sure.
speaker nerds, whose
Just-
entire goal is to avoid that effect so that you can get a different and more accurate sound field.
So I'm just putting the Spirit Torino up on the screen.
Ooh.
Oh god. Yeah. So the Torino is something that it looks horrible. The graph looks horrible.
Just noting Metal 571's comment here in the corner.
But
you guys can't see it all.
it's not as bad as the graph looks. Not in my opinion. At least. Again, I've heard worse. It's
Yeah.
bad, but it's not. It's not. This doesn't make my ears bleed.
Sure.
I mean, I'm not sure I'd expect it to, depending on the music. Like, that looks to me, not wanting to sound hostile to a competitor, but like a pretty quintessentially flawed response, but not one that you couldn't find enjoyable. I can think of a lot of stuff that has a lower mid dip like that a lot of people like,
Yeah,
or at least find
HGA20.
tolerable.
It's no
Listen.
O Bravo at least.
Sorry, I rudely cut off Matt Economist there.
No, you, no, that was a much better follow up anyway.
And what's like, and then I guess my other ultimate thing is, and I know it's not headphones, but like, what happens when, like, I've also noticed this trend, and I see it a lot with like people that have been listening to music for a long time, and especially when they get into like the speaker world or even just headphones, and they're in the top end, like they're hitting the end of their their end game, I guess, if you want to call it that. But like, I'd say majority of them, I don't want to throw a statistic because I don't know a statistic, but I could make one up and say like 90% are listening majority of the time through tube amps, which, if you look at measurements for a tube amp compared to a solid state, like how does that, I know that's not the same, different things, but like how does that jive like with your guys' thought process on it? Because that
Depends on the tube amp
Harmonic
part.
distortion.
yeah, like
Harmonic distortion is inherently pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the camp. I mean, okay, not inherently, but like, okay, let's
Most
say
of the time.
even harmonic distortion, and as long as it's not that high. Like if it's
Right.
like D6 or like D8, like okay, that's a bit too far. But I'm on the camp that distortion is not inherently bad, especially if it's harmonic distortion. If it's noise, then yeah, that's a different thing altogether. But in terms of harmonic distortion, I don't think it's bad unless it's really, really high order harmonic distortion.
It's
In that
almost like
case,
the
it's
term is wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, do
But,
bear in
yeah.
mind though, harmonic distortion is the manifestation of system nonlinearity for, like a single tone input, or like the harmonics
It
come
is.
from. So, but the thing about that is that if you have an input that isn't, a sine wave, you get intermodulation products instead of harmonic distortion products. And that's true even with low order stuff. They will be low order intermodulation products, but they will still be not harmonic distortion once you're feeding it a complex stimulus,
Mm.
or at least not purely harmonics.
I'm not gonna lie to you, dude. You just said words.
That's fair. Admittedly, the distortion thing, I will say, vis-a-vis your question, that was just me quibbling with Crin. Vis-a-vis your question, my answer would probably be most tube amps are still less distorting than a lot of speakers that people like.
Right.
Or even headphones.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is an element of what pleasant distortion, like people hearing that as pleasant, to the degree where I almost think this gets a little bit into the whole ASR thing where people they're like measuring tube amps and stuff, and you think, well, that doesn't seem like a good idea. But
this distortion guitars are like a thing.
Well, that's a thing.
Like taking
that's
literally taking an acoustic analog instrument and adding distortion onto it.
But even for good music, no, just kidding. But
this, man.
Even with like good tube amps, though, in theory, well, here's what I would wonder: would it be possible to devise some sort of like harmonic distortion index that would be able to predict whether or not the experience would be a pleasant one? Where you could say, here's the thresholds for where it gets unpleasant and something like that. And then you could, in theory, measure a tube amplifier, get the distortion, plots for it, and then see how closely it lines up with some sort of like distortion to pleasure index.
So I will note, you're arguably slightly jumping the gun here on people like tube amps because of the distortion. That's not
of course, that's just a total assumption there.
Level.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's all sorts of things. Like
it smells nice. I don't know. It glows.
The heat keeps you warm in the winter.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of nice ritual elements that tubes and vinyl both have this. Tubes warm up, vinyl you have the process of playing it, and I think that actually is undercredited as helping.
I've been saying this for a while. Like, if you've listened, like, it's the entire experience of a thing that people are not taking into account sometimes, right?
Yeah, I mean that's what defines how we interact with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's a thing that you can, like, the moment of grabbing, like, picking the headphone, picking the music you want to listen to.
Unfortunately, I don't know if you could measure.
No, you can't.
That the way you can measure second and third order harmonic distortion.
Give me a brain probe and I'll figure it out.
Yeah, so it's like
maybe.
Neuralink. Let's get the Neuralink.
Let's get the
going.
yeah. But yeah, no. Like, do you think that would, like, let's assume that there is, let's say, pleasant distortion. If that's the case, I mean, and if that's again the big assumption here is that people are buying them for the, let's say, pleasant distortion, because I think in reality it's more that people are buying them because they think it's going to sound good, and then there are distortion products in there.
Yeah, I mean, like, we don't even need to say they think it's going to sound good. We can just say for a lot of them they buy them because they sound good.
No, but like they don't even haven't heard them yet. They're just assuming that it's going to. Yeah.
Well, then that's also groupthink to some level.
Totally.
Right? The masses are saying tubes are good, and they're like, yeah, tubes are good. I'm getting me a tube. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
Y'all are very uncharitable, these poor people.
It's because we're all objectivists here, especially Tyler. Okay.
I'm extremely objectivist.
I wanted to briefly get back to a question for Crin with his with the new measurement rig and everything. And a while back, I sent you that 900 hertz. Well, I called it the 900 hertz neutral target, but the IEF neutral, I think you've called it, right? And I wanted to. You've explained to me why you use this target. But maybe you can sort of give a rundown for everybody else, and just so everybody's aware, basically what this target is it's 2018. Well, it's 2018 Harman with a flat line all the way down from 900 hertz, rather than taking the rather than taking the contoured sort of like lower mids and then bass shelf from either Harman target. And you've changed the treble now as well, I think.
I didn't change any.
Okay.
I didn't change anything. I think. Yeah. The simplest thing, the simplest explanation I can give is that it's just what sounds perceptually neutral to me. And I mean, let's take something like HD 600 for example. Like a lot of people say that it's mid bassy, but to me it just sounds just rolled off. I don't think it's that mid bassy, but I do think that the hit gain or pinner gain, whatever you want to call it, is at the right positions.
Somewhere Sean Olive is crying.
As in the okay, in comparison to something like diffuse field or even Harman in-room linear, I think those target curves sound very shouty and rolled off at the same time. So at least when it's applied to a headphone directly without any other post-processing. So I decided, like, you know what is the amount of reduction I can do to that hit gain region of like 1K all the way up to 8K, and how much extra bass do I need to make it to sound less thin and sound, not rolled off. So I did play around and just realized, like, you know what, the Harman AE OE 2018 target has that sort of almost locked in. It's just that I don't agree with the way that it scoops out the lower mid range. I think I prefer to have that lower mid range region to be completely flat. And since it's a neutral target and not a preference target, I decided, you know what, let me just do the whole thing flat. Another way to look at it is that I am simply not compensating for frequencies under 900 hertz.
Right.
Which means that I'm just leaving everything down there as it is, and you're free to come up with your own interpretations. Like, that region is completely untouched. The only thing that I touch is really the hit gain, pinner gain regions, which I believe to be perceptually neutral.
But the gain, your HRTF extends down to like 200 hertz.
But so when you look at that,
I know. It's just that to me, when I put it on something with all the way, like if you roll it off all the way to 200 hertz, I think it sounds thin.
Just with that though, I mean, if you look at what that old Sean Olive just tweeted it at me recently, but the old graph there from Tile that showed which from Inner Fidelity that showed which parts of the ear were amplifying which frequencies. There wasn't really that much going on below 900 hertz, and so that's why I always sort of assumed that like, okay, there was potential for there to be other factors that play a role in this, and then this is part of what the brain expects to hear. I'm sure that is influenced there, but as far as like the physical ear itself and what that's doing, there wasn't that much below 900 hertz, and so I was just assumed you just selected the ear-related gain factors to consider, and then see, and this is where it's interesting to me because
that's more or less what it is.
Yeah, but what's interesting about this to me as well is that this happens to you didn't pick necessarily like a DF comp for this. Like, you just went with Harman for this, which is also still preference based. So it's like it's one of those where it's like it correlates with ear related gain factors.
Yeah, So the thing about a Harman 2018 target is that I think it sounds more or less perceptually neutral. It's just that with that bass boost, and the moment you remove that bass boost, it just sounds neutral.
Right.
So I have we need to have a talk at some point about that, cringe.
Bring it on,
Will Robinson.
But I think more productive at the moment, y'all are drawing a distinction between preference curves and neutrality, which I'm not sure I entirely get. Like, what makes a preference curve different to a curve that sounds correct?
People don't necessarily prefer neutral.
Why?
No, don't necessarily prefer what they
that
think is neutral. Sorry, I should just make that distinction, because
I mean, neutral. Okay, the whole concept of neutrality, the way that I see, is that just every frequency sounds of equal volume. All right.
So your definition of neutrality is equal loudness.
Yeah. I mean, okay, then you have things like the equal loudness contours like throwing in. But I'm just assuming, like, you know what, as long as it's perceptually every single frequency sounds of the same volume, that is how I determine my neutral target. But I do have a graph tool that's up that you could just compensate to diffuse field, free field, Harman in room flat, Harman AEOE 2018. So the choice is there. It's just that I'm just
Oh
gonna
yeah,
put
no, I
my
appreciate. No. I mean,
yeah.
I your tool is fantastic. I love that you give people options, and frankly, I think that that sets a standard that we should all try to live
Yep.
up to. But I won't, because it's much easier to just show stuff with DF.
I mean, like before I came in, I'm sure people were much more used to DF compensated headphone graphs. I
No, they were
tried.
used to
I want.
freaking independent of direction because of
Oh
tile.
fuck. I need to add that in as well, like one of the days. But I need the data for like the grass KEMA versus Tiles head acoustics HMS 223 or whatever it was.
Well,
And like
ironically, what you're doing might be actually more similar to independent of direction than you think, because the directionally independent components of the HRTF, which it removes, are specifically in the band that you've chosen to destroy.
then why is Tiles compensation so much higher in that region?
Because it's not entirely. There's still directional components there, and so like Head Acoustics didn't completely scrap it. You basically took their thing up to 11.
Just something. Metal 571 says Harman is by definition a preference curve because it is an average of people tweaking shelf filters, not directly based on converting speakers in a room to a headphone target. But
Okay.
it used to be that, and then he says maybe Mad can correct or expand.
So preference target, like the preference curve concept, I'm still not entirely sure, and I'm not sure how much of the time y'all have spent on like the history of target curves, but like at least since the 80s, we've been verifying target curves for neutrality in part by the fact that people prefer them subjectively. That was true with DF in the 80s. That was true with
Sure.
attempts to improve on DF in the early 2000s. The Harman target, like all of them, starts with an acoustic situation as a reference. In the case of DF, it's synthetically direction independent sound. In the case of Harman, it's two Ravel F, 208s in the Harman reference room. And then with the Harman target, they went through two very odd hoops with that. First, they equalized the speakers flat in room on an Omni mic. Then they recorded that, and then they let people equalize both the speakers and the headphones. But people made about the same changes to both of them, which is why the original conclusion of Olive, Welty, and McMullen 2013, well, the second one, was people want basically the same thing from both. So given the ability to play with both speakers and headphones, people want generally the same thing, and that same thing basically approximates what we hear as neutral in most cases. Personally, sorry, yeah?
Well, I was on that subject. I mean, do you think it would have changed if they asked people what they thought was neutral rather than what they actually would have preferred? Like, not like, it's difficult because it kind of breaks the whole, like, changing the lenses for glasses analogy. But I wonder if that would have influenced, the response.
Well, I think it depends in part on what you use. For your actual source material, for music that is conventional two-channel, I think that accurate is kind of not possible. Like, you can't actually, there's nothing that you're replicating. There's no original situation. What you have is essentially an artwork created collaboratively between a studio team and a musician that's being reproduced, via your speakers.
This is always headphones. The circle of confusion again.
Yeah. With a binaural recording, you can have, does the sound pressure at the eardrum match what it was in the original case? Because there is an original sound to compare to. And
but
in that case,
people have heard that original sound, though.
Yeah, and for that matter, who cares? It matters for localization for sure, and that's one of the reasons that I think keeping more of the features of a finely grained DF HRTF is useful for a headphone.
Yeah.
But for accuracy with a recording that was made. I mean, the neutral preferred distinction doesn't make a ton of sense to me, because unless we're assuming that people consistently like something they perceive as non-neutral, which doesn't seem to align with what people subjectively report.
I see. That's where I don't know, because people. Have you listened to the music people like these days? Like, it's. I mean, that's just a subjective thing, of course.
You sound,
but like,
you sound judgmental right now. And
I
do
am.
not appreciate
I
it.
absolutely am. But
Wow.
people prefer all kinds of things that aren't necessarily people like, not just in terms of music, but like in terms of like everything.
Art to
Yeah.
pictures to
Yeah, I mean
Well-
that's that's what I see most commonly as resistance to the Harman, the various different versions of the Harman target. Like, I'll post something and say, oh, this doesn't measure that great relative to the Harman target. Like, Harman's just preference. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
but like it still sounds good. But
Well, but the whole thing of, I guess the it's just preference thing is what I'm kind of anxious of, because with music, with the media, just everyone has their own preferences. I like a lot of really weird European folk fusion stuff that is objectively terribly recorded and in general objectively terrible. But that's just what I happen to like to listen to. And Swedish pop music, which again, objectively absolutely terrible.
Roxette is awesome, dude.
But for reproduction equipment, for the stuff that's playing it back, I don't think that it's quite as clear cut as people just like different things, in part because we can show that even people with very different tastes in music, do have pretty consistent clusterings of what they like in playback equipment. Like, that's the whole big project that Sean's been on for a long while.
Yeah, I know what you mean, and a lot of it is like what emerged from that, not necessarily, and it's all split in terms of demographics and whatnot as well. But to me, it still indicates that because there's such a split in even just looking at the demographic data, right? To me, that still suggests that there's some preference-based disagreement that's influenced by people not necessarily thinking about it as trying to achieve reference, but they're trying to simply just report what they prefer. And again, I don't know if that's going to result in any difference, because at the very least we have to think about like the ear-related gain factors and how. Let's say the degree to which the like 3 kHz region is elevated, right? I think that's something that like because of, or at the most coarse-grained level, you can say most people prefer that, and therefore it's probably also something that should exist as in a reference target. And I don't think there's any, I don't have any issues with that, but what I wonder about a little bit more significantly is all the stuff that's going on below 900 hertz, which is what Crin has sort of omitted, like the base shelf and all that stuff. And whether or not that would change if you asked, people a different question. But
Well, part of the problem with reference though is like,
whose reference?
yeah, like what is the reference? That was
I
my
know,
point regarding the as I said, you can have a recording of a real sound in space, and you can look at how a device reproduces that.
mm-hmm.
But that's not the majority of our recordings. Our recordings are creative works where the sound actually is created in the studio in large part. Not entirely, but everything from having distortion pedals to effects to just mixing and mastering are part of what makes our music sound how it does. And that's not an acoustic event.
Mm-hmm.
So there isn't an accurate reproduction of that in the sense of something that recreates something that happened, because that never happens.
This is all circle of confusion again as well. Like, there's just no escaping that. But
even without circle of confusion, there's just the relevancy of the concept of accurate kind of breaks down when there isn't something that first existed. I think they're all basically interpretations.
Well,
of the
actually,
recording.
though, I mean, if you the exception, I think, is for musicians, people who've been in. I'm just thinking of like Tyler grew up with musicians, right? And so did I. And like people who are actually listening to those, not necessarily where they're in recording studios, not all the time at least, but there
to stages to
at the very least
festivals
there's
to-
some kind of reference there. Say if you're listening to somebody play an acoustic guitar live, like not just live in a stadium, but like live just in a room.
campfire.
Yeah, like you've heard that before, and at the very least there's a sense of what that is supposed to sound like. And I get that this is like, you know, this, there's all these other different factors in there as well that have to do with the engineering, you know, mastering, recording equipment, and all this stuff. But like, at the very least, I'd like to think that should at some point be considered in trying to find reference.
Well, but different guitars sound different, and they sound different in different rooms. Like,
Oh, sure,
my
yeah.
mother was a folk musician, and one of the things that I remember viscerally from being a kid is that sometimes she would walk into a room and be like, "Man, I want to, play my guitar," or "Man, I want to sing in this room," just because
Yeah,
the reverberant characteristics were what she happened to like, and she loved it
Just
incredibly.
walk
live
into a
rooms.
room and start clapping.
Yeah.
I've definitely seen that.
So-
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And that's so there's unless you know where that was originally happening, it's really hard to figure out what's an accurate reproduction of a situation that's different than the one that you experienced. That's where I mean where reference is sort of a problematic point here. If you have a specific thing where you can look at this was the original and then look at how well it's reproduced, it's much easier. But with music, unless you take the mastering studio playback as the original, which, I mean, you could, but I mean, I think Tyler was originally coming in to complain about the idea that what the mastering engineer hears should be what everyone should hear.
Yeah, like that's not. I don't think that's. I mean, it's just different, right? Like there's, because they're actually using two different things that they should be, from my understanding. Is they usually have a reference monitor setup, and then they have the enjoyment setup. If that makes sense.
Well,
So really, we should be using whatever the mastering engineer enjoys.
but
Yeah,
but
I mean, at the
but
end of
that
the day, that's what you're listening to. Right?
I guess I don't know. Like just metal makes a good point. It's just that, the TLDR for this is that the circle confusion is still unbreakable.
Well-
unless we're using just not everybody's using the Harman target and tuning everything to the Harman target. But I think the resistance that, again, like I'm all on board with Harman. I use it for my reference curve. Well, I use the combined one, but like even the 2018 one sounds fine to me. But in general, like I empathize with the resistance to the preference-based target as being a version of let's say vernacular or like common usage of neutral, because there's the repugnant conclusion here is that what happens if everybody just says they like V-shaped sound, and or everybody just likes only bass and treble, and then we lose mids or something like that. And you start to see that, I feel, a little bit in when you skew the demographics down. Like you start to see a little bit more of that, and that's what makes me empathize a little bit with. Well, I don't need to pay attention to whether or not this matches the reference curve, because the reference curve is just based on people's preferences, and they all listen to EDM and whatever else that's only about bass and something along those lines. That's what I've heard, and I want to be able to have some sort of answer to that, but it seems difficult to do.
Well, I feel like I sit on the exact opposite pole, because I probably, when Sean did his clustering experiment to see where people fall relative to the Harman curve, I would probably be one of the most extreme outliers in terms of
But yeah,
how much I like
you
it.
like diffuse, like the DF treble kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, just pretty much flat.
Yeah.
So I like meaningfully less bass than the Harman target,
Yeah.
and meaningfully more treble, to the point that I would probably have changed the average slightly if I was included in the original experiments. But accepting that there's a range of variation, and there absolutely is, and no one should ever belie that. But accepting that, I'm really cynical of the whole argument that something that's referenced to what people like isn't accurate, or is in some way less accurate than something that's referenced to an arbitrarily selected sound field. Like if you want to say that there could be a hypothetical reference that would be better, then maybe I could get on board with that. But a lot of people are contrasting it with some other target which has an even less viable tie to what we
Totally.
perceive as
Yeah.
accurate.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing I like about the Harman target. At the very least, is that it's anchored to something that's a lot more, usable as a reference target.
So, I have a couple things real quick, just because I wanted to jump in but there's someone actually just mentioned it too. Most engineers actually, when they're mastering, good ones will have the artists in the room as they master to get that preference down, just as a heads up. And then the next thing is like the artistic component from the target discussion. So I guess that's kind of where that kind of lies in. And then I had another one. So I'm multi-parting because it's hard to get an word in edgewise with you folks.
Sorry.
Actually, I'm gonna punt this to Crin real quick. I want to get his take on this. So Crin, just not because I'm more any other reason than because I'd like to hear your wonderful voice again here. Let's see here. So what's your thoughts on how the basically sound being good being coupled to better measurements is not necessarily more enjoyment out of that, right? Like, so does that make sense? Like, so I'm actually pulling this from a different question and topic from a different thing right now, but it's the basically frequency range or frequency neutrality or what have you gets coupled too much, like that it's good to measurements rather than to enjoyment of said thing.
Right. So let me just see if I could rephrase that. If something measuring well isn't necessarily as attached to the enjoyment.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what you're?
Yeah. So I'm trying to interpret the question in a way that's a question. It was a statement.
Okay,
It was a statement rather than a question.
I get it. Yeah. So the way that I see measurements is it's not necessarily to find a headphone that sounds good, but rather to identify the ones that are bad, because you can absolutely see from a frequency response graph how badly a headphone would sound, because there are very obvious things that deviate from the norm, so to speak, and all of this will result in something that you could reliably predict to sound bad. But in terms of whether or not something would sound good, that would be all about preference and preference and everything. Like, you could like a V-shaped signature, you could like a warm signature, you might prefer a sub-bass boost under 200 hertz, or you prefer a much warmer boost that encompasses a much lower Q factor that boosts like 800 hertz all the way down. So predicting what you would like using frequency response measurements is actually very doable when you have identified what kind of frequency response you actually like. But whether or not this is good, like objectively so, that is a much harder question to answer.
Well, that's really why the Harman research is so useful, is because it's an answer to what most people would find good to a certain extent. And so at the very least,
right?
Yeah, but at the very least,
starting point.
Yeah, and like it's better than trying to say, okay, well, at least when it comes to like representation of the data, right? Because somebody might be like Mad Economist, an outlier, and then not fall within the range of people who do find Harman 2018 preferable to DF or something like that. And you'd have to know that, I think, because it's or at least you'd find out pretty quickly, I think, because I think that there's good reason why most people prefer, like, it makes sense to me when you think about, like, okay, the type of sound that it ends up having, whether or not you personally agree with it is a different question.
And that kind of goes into like the next thing that was kind of asked about. It was like, there's people that are coming new into this hobby, right? And they come in and they see different forums, different whatever, and because they're looking for advice. And then whoever's the loudest gets the most attention, right? And so they'll be, let's say they go in and they see that they'll see the uncolored, true to the source stuff, and I'm quoting a little bit from this comment. But it leads them down a path that's just, it's objectively good, but just is fatiguing and not very enjoyable to them, right? And then they end up wasting all this money
This is,
and maybe getting the negative, like there's that side of it too. Like, how does that?
This makes
like,
me think of Steve Guttenberg's. He did a video on this where he's saying, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but it was something along the lines of like the reason he doesn't pay too much attention to measurements, and I think he was referring to like source equipment measurements more than headphones or anything, but he was saying
I
the
think
reason
he had a more provocative title than that.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it was.
We're being a little more.
It was great. Yeah, it was a little bit funny as well, but because it was a little bit tongue in cheek as well. But yeah, he was saying the reason why he doesn't pay too much attention to them is because it's not something that will indicate the longevity, or this was one of his points at least, that it's not good measuring equipment doesn't indicate longevity for how something is considered or seen in 10 years time. I don't know about that, because I think
I mean, I do get that argument in terms of source measurements, but in terms of headphone measurements, the most revered headphones.
I was gonna say,
the best measurement. Like for example, the HD 600s, 650s.
Economist ER4.
That's the most obvious example. The other one would be the KSC 75s.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
There are some counterexamples, like for example the HD 800. But
I mean,
I know Matt Economist likes it.
I also like it, but I like it for the intangibles, like the sound.
Oh, for sure, I like it as well. Yeah, I like it too.
It's so technical, but yeah, I use liberal amounts of EQ on my HD 100, and that's with the Super DuPont mod.
Yeah, but so like I think there's all kinds of reasons why, like I think his argument breaks down even in headphones, because there's all kinds of reasons why headphones become iconic that aren't necessarily attached to their frequency response or even like their sound quality. Like you can, I mean, yes, the legendary stuff in the audiophile world, like the HD6XX and 650 and all those are good examples of when it does, but there's also examples of I'm just thinking of like the M50X, which is like, not revered,
but the M50X is like it's mainstream.
Not, it is, but it's still something that people today for some reason want.
It gets revered not because the audiophiles approve of it, but because the mainstream approves of it.
Yes. But and even the HD 800 is a counterexample.
The other thing that sort of guarantees a headphone's longevity, so to speak, is its obscurity. in a certain
there's
way.
that, but what about
so for example, people have been hearkening on and on about the Tucket H2 Plus. It's a horrible headphone. I've heard it once. I thought it was bad, but people kept saying like, "Oh, your source was not great," and blah blah blah. But as more and more people start to get ears, and I know DMS managed to get his ears on a Tucket as well, and I felt so vindicated when he finally said the thing that it was absolute garbage, which I agree. But that's the thing. No one could confirm how bad it actually was because of how obscure it was. And it's the same thing for something like, let's say, a vintage Yamaha orthodynamic or some weird Sony headphone that no one else has actually owned for the last 30 years, or even something like the Sony
I was
MDR
just going to bring
R10.
up the R10.
Yeah,
because that's another one that's
I've actually heard the R10.
Topical.
Yeah,
it has the sound stage that betrays its closed back status, but it's wonky. I can't put it in any more nicer terms. The R10, it sounds wonky.
Is it one of those things where like it's like frequency response tricks to for soundstage benefits?
Maybe, but in terms of I've not
right?
seen a frequency response measurement of an R10, but I can assure you it's probably gonna look wonky as hell.
I just saw the one that was compared that Hi-Fi Man was using to compare, which I mean like I don't know what system they're using for that. But
to go back to my original point, yes, obscurity ensures a headphone's longevity by virtue of no one else being there to counter counter the height.
perhaps.
Could you even say like obscurity or even like negativity and positivity too? Like there's that factor of like something that's getting a lot of bad hype, but it's like always in people's faces to the point where they like
the HD820.
Yeah. Like now I want to go listen to this, or now I need to hear it for myself. Or it's so.
Yeah,
I don't know about longevity.
So something like the
Not longevity,
820,
but
I
just-
wouldn't call it obscure because you like most stores already have it. Like even Best Buy has like
Has
820 on
HDR.
display at some point.
Yeah.
So,
Wait, it does?
but if you're talking about something that's really bad and people have like really want to hear it, I would probably would be one of the AMT headphones from Obravo.
Oh yeah.
I still haven't heard one, but I really want to hear one.
Yeah.
Oh, Bravo's really taking some hits in this
Yeah.
podcast.
So, actually,
To be
yeah,
fair, we're talking about measurements. They're gonna have
Measurements,
to.
But that's
Suffer
that's
those
the
risks.
question Tyler was originally sort of posing, is like situations where correlation with good met with the target isn't necessarily or there's
enjoyable.
but that's what we were talking about earlier as well, where what I think you're referring to is different from if I say this measures a certain way on the rig but I don't hear it that way, right? That's different from saying this measures poorly on a rig but I still enjoy it, or this measures really good on a rig and I don't enjoy it, right?
I wonder what good measurements can be if they don't correlate with us enjoying things.
So that's kind of where I'm
the
at
thing,
with
too.
this.
It's like,
Yeah.
It's like at the end of the day, it's still so obscure. It's not even
like to me, like a at the very least, like there's all kinds of other factors in enjoying something, but at the very least, if it has a frequency response that I like, that I measure it, and I end up liking that frequency response, whether or not it matches the target, okay, as long as it gets pretty close, I'm probably I feel like that predicts it for me, that I'm going to enjoy it. At the very least, like maybe it's like got grainy mids or something, I don't know, and there's other issues, but at the very least there'll be something about it that I can enjoy. So I'm maybe I'm unique in that, but yeah.
I do have one. Oh, go ahead, Crin.
Oh yeah. The other thing that I would like to at least to just talk about the benefits of measurements as a whole is that it at least provides a certain level of accountability to headphone manufacturers. Because for
Hopefully.
the longest time, ever since Tal retired, there have been very little people out there who actually picked up the slack. And for that reason, we have a lot of weird headphones coming out. I would say there seems to be a lot of weird headphones coming out. And yes, measurements, especially frequency response measurements, don't directly correlate, like in terms of the hobby and everything. Let's not talk about objectively speaking. In terms of the hobby, it doesn't directly correlate with how good a headphone would sound. But it does show, again, as I've spoken previously, it does show whether or not something would sound bad.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't tell you how something would sound good, but it tells you how something would sound bad.
Yep.
So there is that accountability. Like a manufacturer, if they want to release a flagship headphone for like $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, they at least need to have a palatable frequency response. I'm not saying it has to be good, because again, no one can define what exactly is good unless you want to say that the Harman target is the only definition of good. But in terms of like frequency response, it at least has to have a minimum standard of like don't have like complete bass roll off, don't have weird spikes in the treble, don't have this like weird recessions, weird hums, and all that. Especially in like a problematic region, so to speak, like 800 hertz, 1000 hertz, 6000 hertz, those really weird and wonky regions where if you over boost or over recess it, things really start to fall apart. I
was going to mention another counter example that kind of it falls in line with that. Somebody mentioned it in the chat, actually. It's the DT 1990 Pro, and there's a headphone that I mean, is there any target that this measures good on? Maybe a DF target, but even then, it has some issues in the treble.
The
And
1990 measures pretty similarly to the T90, right? I haven't seen a measurement
so
of
the
it.
T1 or the
No, the T90.
Oh, I'm not sure.
The mini Tesla.
Oh, I haven't seen a measurement of that one.
I haven't seen a measurement of the 1990.
Okay. Okay, but in general, it's got, okay, let's say relative to Harman at least. Any Harman, it does not measure well because it extends in the bass just fine, but it's got a very strong peak there, like 8.5 kHz. And so this is one that it's very popular, and like people use it in studios and whatnot, but it's very popular and it's also controversial, and some people seem to love it, and I'm not gonna say I hate it, but I hate certain things about it. And this is, to me, it's like it's a perfect clear-cut example of what Crin's talking about, how it'll at the very least tell you if there's something wrong, something that you're not going to like. And yeah, that to me is like, yeah, maybe people like it, but for me, that frequency response predicted it correctly. Okay, I have more that I want to actually go over with you guys. If we're okay moving on from that.
Sure.
I wanted to actually ask Bad Economist a few questions here. I want to ask, now that there's a number of us who have the 43AG and we're testing headphones and we're, publishing data. Is this something that ends up being useful for you, like you're a headphone manufacturer? Does the fact that we now have like comparable data, across a number of different, sources, with the same rigs and everything, does this help manufacturers?
Well, I think it helps manufacturers, but it also subjects us to some risk. One of the nice things for a manufacturer for a long time is that because there were only maybe 4 people doing measurements, none of whom even had the same system, some of whom didn't even have an appropriate system for measuring headphones, you could write off quite easily when your headphones were quite variable.
Mm-hmm.
I think those days are over.
Hell yeah.
If something was measured by you and by Crin and by Speakerphone, by you and by Brent Butterworth,
Mm-hmm.
by you and Keith Howard, and there's a big difference, people may ask why, and that's a good thing from the consumer standpoint and a worrying thing from the manufacturer's standpoint.
Well, hopefully everything's done correctly for everybody as well, right? Which
it's hard.
Yeah.
I think at a manufacturer level, I don't know. I mean, these days it seems like everyone is that I talk to, which is, I'm not that exposed in the industry, is generally has a measurement that they're aiming for on an anthropomorphic measurement system, and those are all going to be within some tolerance of each other.
Mm-hmm.
I think, is it good or bad? I'm not sure if it's that different from how it's always been, because I mean, if you think about it, you go back to the HD 600, the HD 580, the DT 880. Those all were created. I mean, the DT 880 predates modern hats, and yet it's still been pretty much the same, and they were all made fairly consistently since 1980 or 1981 or whatever. I think measurements are handy from an R&D standpoint, and as you said, I think they're handy for a keeping manufacturers accountable standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think people being focused on measurements incentivizes some trends in manufacturing, and they're ones that I like, but I could understand why someone would have misgivings about that becoming dominant, because unless with only a single with a single frequency response measurement under well-coupled circumstances, you're going to see incentives for certain principles of design that might not always be most preferred on people's heads.
Right.
So, mixed bag.
But I mean, that also means that it's just a matter of also continuing to push the boundaries on making sure that or trying to get it closer to what the experience is like on people's heads.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, if anything, I think that's, and you have folks like Ratings have tried they have some iffy stuff, but I think that things like their in-ear measurements of bass roll-off represents a pretty meaningful improvement on what consumers are able to access. I'd really love to see y'all implement something similar, even if it's just controlled leakage like Keith Howard at Headphone Test Lab has.
Right. They were doing stuff before. Ratings was doing stuff before with like group delay and whatnot to try and predict soundstage. And that's one where I don't know if it worked out so great though. But I like the isolation and leakage tests because that seems to be quite useful, especially because people wear glasses and stuff all the time. For over ear headphones, closed back headphones, but IEMs of course as well. Actually, on the subject of IEMs, I did want to get into another question for Crin. Actually, I have questions for both you guys, but I went through. I recently reviewed the Neo 64 Audio Neo, and of course had to try out your mod. And I wanted to sort of ask for anyone who's unaware that essentially what you do is you take a little piece of foam from the tip and you insert it into the back port of the Neo, or of the N8 in this case. But I wanted to sort of get your take on like modding IEMs in general. I mean, is this something people should be doing?
I think modding in general is something that should be done. If it gets you closer to your desired sound, why not?
Is there any, I mean, in the case of the N8 specifically, is there any like risk to like damaging anything by blocking?
I mean,
the port?
I damaged my N8, so.
Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, I damaged my N8.
By
so
doing
I had to send mine to.
Oh no.
Because I wanted to make mine like semi-permanent.
Right.
So I put the foam really deep into the tubing. And then I realized that there was some error that I had to correct. So I had to use a needle and everything. And then I did something wrong. And yeah, I had to send it back for RMA. And thankfully, 64 Audio graciously allowed that replacement. So yeah, there's definitely risk, which is why I'm trying to find a way to make it less intrusive for the mod. I was thinking about doing it like putting out Scotch tape and then like poking small holes, which achieves the same thing.
Wait, Scotch tape?
Yeah.
Why not just use
Like-
medical tape? That's already porous.
I mean, I don't know if it's the right amount of like porousness or whatever you call that word that is required for that level of air control. Like a lot of these things I don't know the proper term of. I just do stuff when it works.
I'm glad that I added the caveat in the video to not do this, to not damage your IEMs. But
the other thing is because it's so precise to the point where if you really want to do the N8 mod, you need a microphone.
I was gonna say you need to measure it somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't. It doesn't need to be a 711. You could just use like a typical microphone plus tubing coupler thing, but you need that system to verify that your mod is actually channel matched.
It's way too hard to do it otherwise. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. You could do it by ear, but because it'd be oof.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, like what I was able to do, I didn't actually insert the foam. I just covered the hole with the foam, and that achieved a very similar kind of result. But I think you're absolutely right. You can't, like, I don't know if you'd be able to do that by ear because you wouldn't know. You'd have to be very confident in your test tracks, like where your bass levels would be and whatnot. Yeah, it's very cool.
For channel matching, you could actually use the sine sweep. Like that's one of the few cases where just sweeping the tone on head works quite well. Is for left versus right.
Oh yeah,
you have hearing loss.
Actually, something I've noticed as well with channel balance, I'm becoming much more attuned to it. Like it's very easy for me to tell now when there is channel imbalance. Even in like bass frequencies, that's almost like the easiest for me to tell now because like a lot of the time bass. Well, it depends on the recording, but like bass is something that I often hear it ideally in the center, and if that's skewed a little bit, then something's off. Whereas like other instruments that come through might be like, I'm not even talking sine sweeps. Like obviously sine sweeps will will be, you know, more useful for that. But like even just when listening to music, it's like, oh, that doesn't sound right. There's a channel balance. Okay, and actually I had another question for Crin as well on the this sort of piggybacks off what we were talking about before with like manufacturers now aiming for targets and stuff like that, a little bit more, you know, closely given honestly given what you're doing, Crin, with you know, the database and everything. But there's the new Theaudio Monarch and Clairvoyance IEMs that I haven't had a chance to hear them yet, but they seem to be sort of the next big thing, you know. And I just wanted to get your take on, yeah, maybe like, do you think they're like disrupting the market a little bit? You know, we had not long ago Moondrop's Blessing 2 do that to the, you know, more budget segment. But yeah, I mean, disrupting, maybe that's the wrong word, but like another example, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I wouldn't call them truly disrupting the market because they're too high of a price point to do that. Like, yes, they are $700 IEMs competing with what is essentially money, no object IEMs, but 700 is still too high.
Right.
In terms of what is disruptive, I would still say it's something like the Etymologic AR2 or even the Blessing 2, because the Blessing 2 is still at a much more palatable price of $300. And it still competes with, well, not necessarily money, no object, but around the kilowatt price range, which is already really, really impressive for $300. Yeah, so the new Theoro stuff still, it's still really, really good. Like, and the way that they tune it in like a twin fashion, whereas the Clairvoyance for a much more pleasant tuning, and I'll argue more safe tuning, and the Monarch, which is tuned much more to be like a technical, referencey kind of neutral sound, but with that lower mid-range recession and that much more, I'll say, even upper mid-range tuning, you get something that is, while not completely like what's the word I'm looking for? It's like musical. You know, I hate using that word. It's not a musical listen. Right. It's not wet. It's dry. You know, there's those. It's something that, but it's something that a lot of people apparently have heard. Oh, sorry, have liked over the Clairvoyance, and that just shows that, you know, tuning to a what is a more traditionally more boring signature still has a sizable audience base. Like in my review, I said that it was 50-50 for the Clairvoyance versus the Monarch. And now it's actually in the Monarch's favor, like 40-60.
Interesting. Yeah. Do you think that these IEMs and the way that they're tuning them is a direct result of what you're talking about before, with like manufacturers now paying a little bit more close attention to what they're seeing with evaluative measurements, let's say, like trends and things like that?
So this requires a bit of like context of what the IEM market was like back in like 2010 and all that.
Yeah.
The market used to be dictated initially by Westone, UE, JH, and probably a few others that I'm missing out. Hit Direct as well. It used to be Hi-Fi Man, and for the most part, because of the not a lot of people doing measurements of IEMs, like even Tal wasn't that interested in doing measurements of IEMs back then. The market was essentially a huge Wild West. You have a lot of huge variations in terms of tuning and everything, and some would say like, oh yeah, there's like so much variation and so many options to pick from. But as someone who has lived through those years, I would say that it was a lot of those tunings were actually really, really bad.
Yeah.
Like, yes, it's different, but it's not different in a good way, especially in a lot of like the old Westones. Westones, they love to tune it so warm and with so little treble that everything just sounds super muffled.
This is Skylar Gray's preferred tuning.
Then you have Yeah, so as measurements started to pick up, people started to tune with less esoteric signatures. And but then, sorry, I'm getting a bit too ahead of myself. Before the shift towards measurements, the market that started to dictate the direction of where IAMs were supposed to go was Hong Kong, Taiwan, maybe Japan. And those people, to put it nicely, they weren't very proficient at designing an audio circuit. So a lot of times they were much more dependent on snake oil concepts. So some of you may remember something called the hum pristine reference. It's like an ED and a CI driver together. And the way that they marketed it was that it's so expensive because we put a huge, I want to say inductor. It's just this huge rod that you just shoved it in, and it looks, aesthetically speaking, it looks like, wow, like they did something really, really nice and novel. When in actual fact, it's no different from any standard crossover, and it sounds mediocre. I it's not bad. It's just not great. Right. And but people are going on and on about how it's like less is more, less is more. This is a new thing, because back then this was the K10 was all the rage, you know, Noble Audio and their 10 driver setup. And now, you know, there was no one to verify it. There was no measurements of the hum pristine reference back then, so everyone was like just parroting it and saying like, yeah, less is more, less is more. Like we shouldn't be like using so many drivers into an IEM, which is a good train of thought. But then they went too far into the direction, and they went in the wrong. They approached the solution in the wrong way with, again, snake oil, and didn't do anything. But then, you know, we slowly get into the era of measurements where more and more people started to, or should I say, first of all, Tal's the one who started to measure more and more IEMs. Then I came into the fray with the IMM6 tubing coupler, and I eventually upgraded to the 711 coupler. And at that point, we started to see a much greater convergence towards a certain shape of the FR, the ideal FR target. I'm not saying that it's Harman. I'm not saying there's anything else. I'm just saying that there's a shape. Right. It's not like a weird V shape or something like someone forgot to add in a proper crossover, and there's like a huge 1K dip in the middle. You know, people realize that, you know what, if you want to tune something that sounds good, we maybe should pay attention to FR. Maybe just a little bit. Yeah. Just a little bit. And then we slowly got to the point where we have companies like Moondrop, where they pay attention to FR, I would say almost exclusively, but it's very clear that they have their own target curve, which is the VSDF target or whatever. And because of that, they've been doing extremely well. They're one of the most consistent tri-fi companies out there. And we're seeing more and more companies start to converge into, well, let's say just Harman target, like especially in the TWS world, where most IEMs have their own digital signal processing units, and therefore they can just add in EQ whenever they want to. And most of them EQ to a certain variant of Harman target, where the bass boost is like under 200 hertz. There is some smooth-ish form of pinna gain here and there. It's not definitely not one-to-one, but you can tell that it's clearly inspired by the Harman target.
There's that term pinna gain again that Metal 571 is going to be triggered by.
Also, just because I think Tyler's been trying to get us to answer a question from chat for 10 minutes, and that syncs really well. It's aimed at Crin.
I think real quick, it's basically the question was was at Crinacle, but both you, Matt, and Rizal could probably talk about it. Its question is, why do certain people perceive +5 dB pinna gain, pineapple,
Pineapple good.
As neutral, and some people prefer DF-ish pinna gain. Viento ER4 as neutral. That is.
Anecdote away, boy.
What? No, this was targeted at you. My anecdote comes afterwards.
I've
Why do
definitely noticed the
certain people
difference.
perceive? Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to this besides the academic stuff, like a hate-related transfer function and all that. But why do certain people prefer as neutral? Okay, the UERM profile 8 tuning, the way that I see it, is that it is flat at what is it flat at? It is flat if you remove. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to say it. Man, you know, like I sent you that study that was done, and then there was that curve that essentially defined the 711 standard, and I said like, oh, like this target was the one that hit that neutral at the neutral at the eardrum?
Wait, which curve are you talking about?
Like the one with like really really tiny pinna gain that I defined as my neutral target.
Oh yeah, that.
Yeah, like I like that. Like that's the way that I defined it, and the way that I hear neutral, and not beyond the certain fact that I just found it subjectively neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And if some people prefer DF-ish pinna gain, then power to them. I don't know why. There's a difference. To me, I just chalk it up as people just hear differently.
There was I'm just remembering a conversation I had with Anthony a long time ago about how some of this may be affected by how narrow certain elements of the ear canal are, and then maybe this would either increase or decrease sensitivity to a given region. But of course, that all then boils down to HRTF still. So I mean that's why that question is still important. But I also wonder if there's it's tough to really, I think, identify exclusive sensitivity to one particular region if there's something wrong there or something that deviates very strongly there. One person might say, oh yeah, this sounds bad because of this, but not necessarily accurately identify the reason why it sounds bad. So I would more be concerned about like overall tonal balance issues than like for like 3 to 5 kHz, maybe that's more elevated on some IEMs, and it's not as bad if the subsequent region in the treble is not subdued, right? If it's also elevated to have appropriate balance there, that might not be as fatiguing in that region or shouty in that region if then in something that isn't as appropriately elevated, but it still has that, what people call, let's say, pinna gain. And then the consensus is, well, this pinna gain is too much and it should be lower, but in reality it's just because the balance is off. Something like that I could see being responsible. So, if that makes sense.
I see where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So academic anecdote time. As far as HRTF variation, you don't see the between the UERM and the ER4. I don't know about the profile or the Viento. It's like we're talking maybe 10 dB at 3 kilohertz, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see that much variation in diffuse field HRTFs between humans, at least not humans with normal human ears. Maybe if they had like cat ears. But what's interesting is a target very similar to the UERM one was the result of what some would consider the first study that really challenged DF as a conventional target, which was I'm really terrible at pronouncing his name. I think it's Gaetan Lorho. He was a Nokia engineer.
Oh no, the Lorho target. No.
Yeah, well, but the thing is, the Lorho target is actually very similar to that. It's about plus 4 dB on the ear resonance versus, plus 15 or so.
Yeah, but it's really high Q. It's
well,
ridiculously high Q.
Yeah, the lower target also was because it was literally a single, very simple filter that was adjusted. So, I listen. I don't want to shit talk Lorho. My point is that he did show that people did consistently prefer that under certain listening circumstances. Although interestingly, subsequently using that kind of adjustment did not compare well even to conventional DF in Sean Olive's experiments in 2012.
Wait,
Which
so
followed
this
about 2 years.
experiment, wait, I forget. Was this experiment for an in-canal headphone?
No, the Lorho target was used with a HD 650, I think.
That's the problem, isn't it? Because the targets that I define for IEMs and for headphones are kind of pretty different. I want to assume that it's because like the moment you have ear occlusion, your perception of sound just changes quite drastically. But even I don't know the complete answer to that.
Yeah, that one is an interesting question, but it's also about in-ear monitors, so I don't care about it.
Disgusting.
I actually okay. That
you watch out. You're sending me a headphone soon, aren't you?
I was gonna actually ask about that if it's possible to ask about that. But Matt, how's the development coming?
Well, I've managed to send Emotiva A100 into overcurrent protection.
I mean,
I'm not sure if that's good or bad.
You're testing edge cases again too much.
Yeah, I found out that you should definitely. I found out why there's a maximum volume below what's damaging for planers, though. I've been wondering this for a while because, like, I can make these things scream at 130 decibels and it doesn't damage the diaphragm or anything, but it actually permanently can change the resonance frequency because the coil heats so much that it changes the diaphragm tension.
Whoa.
And also makes your hand very toasty.
Makes me nervous about HE6s.
I mean, just don't listen to your headphones at 120 decibels ever. That's the simple rule. If you follow that simple rule, you will be fine.
Yeah.
It's okay. I followed that rule all my life.
Yeah. Okay. I've actually got one more question for Crin, and then we should probably end the stream because we've been going for 2 hours.
We're just getting started.
Yeah, it's just getting good. The question is, when are you gonna start making videos again?
God damn it!
Because I watched it again recently, but your review of a review is the funniest headphone related video I've ever seen. And if anybody hasn't seen it in the chat, go watch it.
Videos take time. I don't have time.
Oh, it does. Don't I know it? I know
it? and I wish I could do it Zio style without editing, but unfortunately, I'm not that like funny on the fly. I need to have like structure. I need to manipulate people into thinking I'm actually funnier than I actually am.
Well, you just need more people to talk about Pratt.
Currently I'm working on the headphone database, which means I'm probably gonna be busy for the next like 3-ish months. Right. And then I'll think about doing videos because each video takes like I want to say 40 man hours.
Yeah.
Not because editing is hard, but because I am not used to editing. Like just opening up DaVinci Resolve is like I don't know what so many I don't know what so many buttons do, and which is why my editing style for the 3 videos that I have is so simple. It's literally just like zoom cuts. But
the thing is, they're effective, you know, like I know, you know, it's nice to have nice B-roll and stuff like that, but like they're some of the most entertaining videos, you know. Just that, yeah, again, if anybody hasn't seen them, I'll add a link to the description for them, but they're really funny.
Yeah, subscribe to me. I post every year.
Yeah, the 3. Well, maybe you will in 3 months, right? We'll see, right? Maybe that'll be the next. You know, we've got you on Twitter now, so.
So, what Patreon tier do you start live streaming your reviewing process?
What Patreon tier do I get the OnlyFans?
Oh no, the live streaming. Live streaming. My review process is only on my OnlyFans.
Right. Okay.
Oh, damn.
This is taking a dark turn.
You can't afford that.
Oh man, that's Never mind crowdfunding the measurement rig. I'm going to crowdfund something else. Okay. On that subject, we should probably end the stream. Any final thoughts from you guys? I've given mine already.
I'm sure Matt has a lot of thoughts.
This is where it begins for Matt. He was up late last night.
I was?
Or the night before.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, other than, like, I'd really like to have a long conversation about what reference means someday, but, like, we had a long conversation about it now, and that wasn't enough, so...
We'll have to do this again. That's what that means.
Mm-hmm.
I have one that would be another. Shouldn't talk about it, but now because we're just out of time. But I have the thought process for me is something that I wanted to talk about, which is kind of like you're talking about the reference. It's a long conversation. It's the in regards to reviews and that kind of stuff, and also measurements and everything. To some level, I think, and people's preference, how synergy between or how things between the music people are listening to evaluate. To the DAC, to the amp, to the headphone, like how does that all, once taken into account, how does that factor into the sound that people hear? Like, so someone loves listening to I'm going to say it, the weeb music.
Pardon me?
Did you say weed?
Weeb.
Okay.
So like no, but like I'm joking. Like people like that stuff, but it does tend to be a little more on the high end, right? Like it's a little bit more treble peaky, from my understanding.
Just on that subject, like so this is an element of the circle of confusion, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
But
yes.
Well, not in the sense of like different recordings and what, like the different parts of the chain, but like in this is something that I think Sean Olive is again, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but he does not like the idea of different tunings for different genres. But and
yes.
to a certain extent, I agree. But this is one of the things that, just talking to manufacturers, where they say different tunings are better for different audiences and different markets.
That's another of the things Sean really doesn't like.
Yeah, but see, that's interesting to me. Though. I imagine it is.
Well, that has been tested. I can provide citations if you want to wait for a minute. But that
danger.
So it's an interesting question, because my intuition was the same, but my read of the lit is that there's not actually a very robust correlation between either the music that people like or where the people are from and what response they want in headphones. Mm-hmm. Which isn't really what you'd think, right? Like a lot of the community dialogue runs counter to that, but that's the finding that Olive had. I think it was in 2013 or 2014 when he studied that, and he's done the same thing with age groups, with nationalities, with trained versus untrained. There's actually been, it's one of the coolest part of the Harman research, weirdly enough, is less the headphone portion, which personally, well, I find cool. It's not terribly novel, but really more that he's just done an incredible amount of due diligence on what factors influence what people want.
The psychology behind it, right? It's like, so there's that too, like hence the newer curves, right? From the most recent, is because people's preferences have changed.
Well,
I don't think that's his take. The adjustment to the 2017/2018 one, from my memory, is basically they redid the shelf experiments again, I think, and that always turns out a little differently because it depends on the spread of preference in your sample base. But the only other big one than that was the change to the ear resonance, and I think that was just a targeted thing based on subjective feedback they got, where they went back and then tested it with that change.
3K, 2 to 3K hertz, roughly, right?
Yeah. There's a change to the shape of the ear resonance.
I also derailed us with that one. Sorry, guys.
We were about to conclude, and you brought us back.
Sorry, we can conclude. But that might be something to be a fun, because I think that's important too, like the chain of a thing and the music that you listen to and how they hear. I think that's important for it, especially for people that are watching reviewers and or watching other people's opinions on things. That could be a factor for them liking things too.
Yeah.
So. That.
Yeah. Final thoughts, Crin. Actually, I wanted one more question for you, for both Crin and Matt. Is there a headphone?
Final thoughts after the final question.
Final
yeah.
question. I no, but I wanted to get to this. Is there a headphone that you guys have listened to in the last, like, let's say 4 months or whatever, like last little bit, that's really stood out to you, that you've gone like, wow, I really like this headphone, and it surprised you?
This is just headphones.
Or well, IEMs as well. But
Oh.
okay, let's limit it to just over-ear headphones, because I know Crin's doing over-ear headphones now as well.
Okay. Over
HCA 20.
Are you sure? Yeah, it is impressive.
He's kidding.
In a different direction. What have I tried? A lot of the headphones that I've tried, because here's the thing, there have been no new headphones in the last 4 months, right? Like most of the headphones that I've tried that I've tried have been all in the last year. I mean, the most obvious one would be the HE1000 in ear speaker configuration.
the Heck 1K.
Yeah. I'm still poking Matt to like build an ear speaker planer.
Listen, it's literally on my to-do list.
Yeah, I know, but do it faster.
Well, pay me.
He's still got to make some intraoral mics for me.
Yeah, incidentally, those mics showed up today. So,
wicked.
Yep, hopefully they should go on Monday.
Yeah. Cool. What about you? Yeah.
I mean, because I've been working on nerd stuff pretty heavily, I haven't been trying a ton of new headphones. Let me think about what's rolled in recently. Other than a whole bunch of random, like, tiny chi-fi stuff that I got basically to scavenge for parts, I've kind of been, and I know this is going to be controversial here, I have kind of been falling in love again with my HD 800.
There it is.
Hell yeah.
That's okay.
That's legitimately, I had it set down for a while. I came back to it, I was like, you know what? Maybe it's not as good as I remember. I put it back on. I was like, nope.
Good.
Perfect.
But the big question is, are you listening to it on tubes?
No. Currently I have it plugged into my freaking RME baby face.
Oh. It's made Tyler sad.
That's tears. Yeah.
Tyler, what about you? Anything in the last like 4 to 6 months that you've been like, wow? And you can't say CMF.
Honestly, I got the heads back in recently.
Oh yeah.
And so that was, and these are on loan from one of the community members, and I haven't listened to them in a while, like since they first came out, and I think that probably it's kind of interesting coming back to them after not hearing them for months at a time, and so that was probably my most like being able to reevaluate them. So not that they were the most wow, but just like that was like that was really.
These came with Crin's goalposts in the box. Yeah.
I've actually heard the head again, and a second sample, and the second sample actually sounded really bad.
Oh, interesting.
Ooh.
Yeah, and like and it had like HD 600, HD 650 staging.
Whoa, that's
weird.
Bad.
I wonder if it's just a bad
and it's
batch.
like so. I don't want to say bloated, but yeah, it's bloat.
Maybe defective. I don't know. That
Maybe
sounds.
defective.
No, I actually measured it. Like at some point, I'll publish it and you can see it. But yeah, it's very different from the one that I initially heard.
Interesting.
Because even these are the ones I have are the newer version 2 with the better headband. So.
Yeah, I think both are the ones that both of the ones I tried have the new.
This
not
one has the
short headband.
Old headband.
But it's not long. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you have the ones with the long ones. I guess that's
Yeah,
both
of them. Yeah,
Zeppelin
both of them are the new ones. Yeah.
Yeah, those are. Is that from Zeppelin and Co?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Zeppelin just replaced the short headband ones with a new one, and that's the one that I don't like.
I wonder if you could have two at the same time, and if you can tell if there's like, unit variation like between the two, like back and forth.
Possible because the one that I hate has like, let me think about it, 8 decibels at 800 hertz.
Jeez, that's way more than this one. This one has like 4.
It's
like
bad.
it's pretty low on this one.
It's real. It's like, yeah, I don't like it. I don't like the like at least one out of the two samples I don't like. Let's
Yeah.
just put it at that.
You should do an average score.
But that's like, how do you, I don't know, that's another question. We'll have to get to this next time, but like there's unit variation for so many headphones as well. Like I know that the LCD-X, for example, is one that's sort of hotly
Okay,
varied.
like if you're taking I have encountered this problem, as you would know, with the Solaris.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but at one point I thought of doing it like the best sample, but then at some point I realized that, you know what, I think an average should be much better.
It's very difficult to do best sample because especially if like if it's a one-off, it's a one-off, right? And maybe there's, that's not representative of like what everybody else would be getting, but like if there's enough times where you can't be confident that somebody's going to get the best version, or something like that, then yeah, I don't think you can.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons why I retired that train of thought, because yeah, I couldn't guarantee it, and I don't want my opinions to mislead someone.
Yeah.
So average, but now the problem is that how do I average two samples?
How do you average a technical score? Like you find the one in the middle.
Yeah, that's the other issue as well. So I need to think about that and all that. For now, it's one of those things I'm like, take like. Oh.
I literally just typed the message.
It's okay. Metal 571's making fun of me again. He says they were ending, then Resolve asked a question.
Oh, by the way, Metal has
half
a
an hour
message
ago
he wants me to convey to you.
Oh, what's that?
He really hates it when you say kHz.
No, I know. He's told me that many times.
He'd like you to switch to kilocycles per second.
No, let's go with clock cycles per second. Kiloclock cycles per second.
What's the clock?
Like we're talking about computers now. We're moving it over to CPUs. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no. I'm probably gonna stick with kHz because it's just shorter. I stumble over my words enough as it is. But on that note, I think, I'm sorry, did I cut you off there, Crin? Or
the final note? No. Continue with the end. Continue with the end.
Okay, we're gonna end it now, guys. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and of course, thanks to the guests, Matt Economist and Crin. I'll leave links in the description for their stuff. I think I've already left it in there, so go check that out and click all the things. Yep. Bye for now. Bye.